Chapter 3. Welch. Back in Battle Mountain, we had stopped naming the Walls family cars because they were all such heaps that Dad said they didn't deserve names. Mom said when she was growing up on the ranch, they never named the cattle because they knew they would have to kill them. If we didn't name the car, we wouldn't feel as sad when we had to abandon it. So the piggy bank special was just the Oldsmobile, and we never said the name with any fondness or even pity. That Oldsmobile was a clunker from the moment we bought it. The first time it conked out, we were still an hour shy of the New Mexico border. Dad stuck his head under the hood, tinkered with the engine, and got it going, but it broke down a couple of hours later. Dad got it running, more like limping, he said, but it never went any faster than 15 or 20 miles an hour. And the hood kept popping up, so we had to tie it down with a rope. We steered clear of toll booths by taking two-lane back roads, where we usually had a long line of drivers behind us, honking in exasperation. When one of the Oldsmobile's windows stopped rolling up in Oklahoma, we taped garbage bags over it. We slept in the car every night, and after arriving late in Muskogee and parking on an empty downtown street, we woke up to find a bunch of people surrounding the car, little kids pressing their noses against the windows and grown-ups shaking their heads and grinning. Mom waved at the crowd. "You know you're down and out when Okies laugh at you," she said. With our garbage bag-taped windows, our roped-down hood, and the art supplies tied to the roof, we'd out-Okied the Okies. The thought gave her a fit of the giggles. I pulled a blanket over my head and refused to come out until we were beyond the Muskogee city limits. Life is a drama, full of tragedy and comedy, Mom told me. You should learn to enjoy the comic episodes a little more. It took us a month to cross the country. We might as well have been traveling in a Conestoga wagon. Mom also kept insisting that we make scenic detours to broaden our horizons. We drove down to see the Alamo. Davy Crockett and James Bowie got what was coming to 'em, Mom said, for stealing this land from the Mexicans, and over to Beaumont, where the oil rigs bobbed like giant birds. In Louisiana, Mom had us climb up on the roof of the car and pull down tufts of Spanish moss hanging from the tree branches. After crossing the Mississippi, we swung north toward Kentucky, then east. Instead of flat desert edged by craggy mountains, the land rolled and dipped like a sheet when you shook it clean. Finally, we entered hill country, climbing higher and deeper into the Appalachian Mountains, stopping from time to time to let the Oldsmobile catch its breath on the steep, twisting roads. It was November. The leaves had turned brown and were falling from the trees, and a cold mist shrouded the hillsides. There were streams and creeks everywhere, instead of the irrigation ditches you saw out west, and the air felt different. It was very still, heavier and thicker, and somehow darker. For some reason, it made us all grow quiet. At dusk, we approached a bend where hand-painted signs advertising auto repairs and coal deliveries had been nailed to trees along the roadside. We rounded the bend and found ourselves in a deep valley. Wooden houses and small brick buildings lined the river and rose in uneven stacks on both hillsides. "Welcome to Welch," Mom declared. We drove along dark, narrow streets, then stopped in front of a big, worn house. It was on the downhill side of the street, and we had to descend a set of stairs to get to it. As we clattered onto the porch, a woman opened the door. She was enormous, with pasty skin and about 3 chins. Bobby pins held back her lank gray hair, and a cigarette dangled from her mouth. "Welcome home, son," she said, and gave Dad a long hug. Then she turned to Mom. "Nice of you to let me see my grandchildren before I die," she said without a smile. Without taking the cigarette out of her mouth, She gave each of us a quick, stiff hug. Her cheek was tacky with sweat. "Pleased to meet you, Grandma," I said. "Don't call me Grandma," she snapped. "Name's Irma." "She don't like it none, 'cause it makes her sound old," said a man who appeared beside her. He looked fragile, with short white hair that stood straight up. His voice was so mumbly I could hardly understand him. I didn't know if it was his accent or if maybe he wasn't wearing his dentures. "Name's Ted, but you can call me Grandpa," he went on. "Don't bother me none being a grandpa." Behind Grandpa was a ruddy-faced man with a wild swirl of red hair pushing out from under his baseball cap, which had a Maytag logo. He wore a red and black plaid coat, but had no shirt on underneath it. He kept announcing over and over again that he was our Uncle Stanley, and he wouldn't stop hugging and kissing me, as though I was someone he truly loved and hadn't seen in ages. You could smell the whiskey on his breath, and when he talked, you could see the pink ridges of his toothless gums. I stared at Irma and Stanley and Grandpa, searching for some feature that reminded me of Dad, but I saw none. Maybe this was one of Dad's pranks, I thought. Dad must have arranged for the weirdest people in town to pretend they were his family. In a few minutes, he'd start laughing and tell us where his real parents live. And we'd go there, and a smiling woman with perfumed hair would welcome us and feed us steaming bowls of cream of wheat. I looked at Dad. He wasn't smiling, and he kept pulling at the skin of his neck as if he were itchy. We followed Irma and Stanley and Grandpa inside. It was cold in the house, and the air smelled of mold and cigarettes and unwashed laundry. We huddled around a pot-bellied cast-iron coal stove in the middle of the living room and held out our hands to warm them. Irma pulled a bottle of whiskey from the pocket of her house dress, and Dad looked happy for the first time since we left Phoenix. Irma ushered us into the kitchen where she was fixing dinner. A bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting harsh light on the yellowed walls, which were coated with a thin film of grease. Irma stuck a curved steel handle into an iron disc on top of an old coal cooking stove, lifted it, and with her other hand grabbed a poker from the wall and jabbed at the hot orange coals inside. She stirred a pot full of green beans stewing in fatback and poured in a big handful of salt. Then she set a tray of Pillsbury biscuits on the kitchen table and ladled out a plate of beans for each of us kids. The beans were so overcooked that they fell apart when I stuck my fork in them, and so salty I could barely force myself to swallow. I pinched my nose closed, which was the way Mom had taught us to get things down that had gone a little bit rotten. Irma saw me and slapped my hand away. "Beggars can't be choosers," she said. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs, Irma said, but no one had been to the second floor in nigh on 10 years because the floorboards were rotted through. Uncle Stanley volunteered to give us his room in the basement and sleep in a cot in the foyer while we were there. "We'll only be staying a few days," Dad said, "until we find a place of our own." After dinner, Mom and us kids went down into the basement. It was a big, dank room with cinder block walls and a green linoleum floor. There was another coal stove, a bed, a pull-out couch where Mom and Dad could sleep, and a chest of drawers painted fire engine red. It held hundreds of dog-eared comic books, Little Lulu, Richie Rich, Beetle Bailey, Archie and Jughead, that Uncle Stanley had collected over the years. Under the chest of drawers were jugs of genuine moonshine. We kids climbed into Stanley's bed. To make it less crowded, Lori and I lay with our heads on one end, and Brian and Maureen lay down with their heads at the other. Brian's feet were in my face, so I grabbed him by the ankles and started chewing on his toes. He laughed and kicked and started chewing on my toes in retaliation, and that made me laugh. We heard a loud thunk, thunk, thunk from above. "What's that?" Lori asked. "Maybe the roaches here are bigger than in Phoenix," Brian said. We all laughed and heard the thunk, thunk, thunk again. Mom went upstairs to investigate, then came down and explained that Irma was hitting the floor with a broom handle to signal that we were making too much noise. She asked that you kids don't laugh while you're in her house, Mom said. It gets on her nerves. I don't think Irma likes us very much, I said. She's just an old woman who's had a tough life, Mom said. They're all sort of weird, Lori said. We'll adapt, Mom said. Or move on, I thought. The next day was Sunday. When we got up, Uncle Stanley was leaning against the refrigerator and staring intently at the radio. It made strange noises, not static, but a combination of shrieking and wailing. That there's tongues, he said. Only the Lord can understand it. The preacher started talking in actual English, more or less. He spoke with a hillbilly accent so thick it was almost as hard to understand as the tongues. He asked all them good folk out there who'd been helped by this here channeling of the Lord's spirits to send contributions. Dad came into the kitchen and listened. It's that sort of soul-curdling voodoo, he said, that turned me into an atheist. Later that day, we got into the Oldsmobile, and Mom and Dad took us for a tour of the town. Welch was surrounded on all sides by such steep mountains that you felt like you were looking up from the bottom of a bowl. Dad said the hills around Welch were too steep for cultivating much of anything. Couldn't raise a decent head of sheep or cattle, couldn't even till crops except maybe to feed your family. So this part of the world was left pretty much alone until around the turn of the century, when robber barons from the north laid a track into the area and brought in cheap labor to dig out the huge fields of coal. We stopped under a railroad bridge and got out of the car to admire the river that ran through the town. It moved sluggishly, with barely a ripple. The river's name, Dad said, was the Tug. Maybe in the summer we can go fishing and swimming, I said. Dad shook his head. The county had no sewer system, he explained. So when people flushed their johns, the discharge went straight into the Tug. Sometimes the river flooded and the water rose as high as the treetops. Dad pointed to the toilet paper up in the branches along the river's banks. The Tug, Dad said, had the highest level of fecal bacteria in any river in North America. What's fecal? I asked. Dad watched the river. Shit, he said. Dad led us along the main road through town. It was narrow, with old brick buildings crowding in close on both sides. The stores, the signs, the sidewalks, the cars were all covered with a film of black coal dust, giving the town an almost monochromatic look, like an old hand-tinted photograph. Welch was shabby and worn out, but you could tell it had once been a place on its way up. On a hill stood a grand limestone courthouse with a big clock tower. Across from it was a handsome bank with arched windows and a wrought iron door. You could also tell that the people of Welch were still trying to maintain some pride of place. A sign near the town's only stoplight announced that Welch was the county seat of McDowell County, and that for years more coal had been mined in McDowell County than any comparable spot in the world. Next to it, another sign boasted that Welch had the largest outdoor municipal parking lot in North America. But the cheerful advertisements painted on the sides of buildings like the Tick-Tock Diner and the Pocahontas Movie Theater were faded and nearly illegible. Dad said bad times had come in the 50s. They hit hard and stayed. President John F. Kennedy had come to Welch not long after he was elected and personally handed out the nation's first food stamps here on McDowell Street to prove his point that, though ordinary Americans might find it hard to believe, starvation-level poverty existed right here in their own country. The road through Welch, Dad told us, led only farther into the wet, forbidding mountains and on to other dying coal towns. Few strangers pass through Welch these days, and almost all who did came to inflict one form of misery or another, to lay off workers, to shut down a mine, to foreclose on someone's house, to compete for the rare job opening. The townspeople didn't care much for outsiders. The streets were mostly silent and deserted that morning, but every now and then would pass a woman wearing curlers or a group of men in T-shirts with motor oil decals loitering in a doorway. I tried to catch their eyes, to give them a nod and a smile to let them know we had only good intentions, but they never nodded or spoke a word or even glanced our way. As soon as we passed, however, I could feel eyes following us up the street. Dad had brought Mom to Welch for a brief visit 15 years earlier, right after they were married. "Gosh, things have gone downhill a little bit since we were here last," she said. Dad gave a short snort of a laugh. He looked at her like he was about to say, "What the hell did I tell you?" Instead, he just shook his head. Suddenly, Mom grinned broadly. "I'll bet there aren't any other artists living in Welch," she said. "I won't have any competition. My career could really take off here." The next day, Mom took Brian and me to Welch Elementary, near the outskirts of town. She marched confidently into the principal's office with us in tow and informed him that he would have the pleasure of enrolling two of the brightest, most creative children in America in his school. The principal looked at Mom over his black-rimmed glasses but remained seated behind his desk. Mom explained that we'd left Phoenix in a teensy bit of a hurry, you know how that goes, and unfortunately, in all the commotion, she forgot to pack stuff like school records and birth certificates. "But you can take my word for it that Jeanette and Brian are exceptionally bright, even gifted." She smiled at him. The principal looked at Brian and me, with our unwashed hair and our thin desert clothes. His face took on a sour, skeptical expression. He focused on me, pushed his glasses up his nose, and said something that sounded like, "What's it times them?" "Excuse me?" I said. "It times them," he said louder. I was completely bewildered. I looked at Mom. "She doesn't understand your accent," Mom told the principal. He frowned. Mom turned to me. "He's asking you what's 8 times 7. "Oh!" I shouted. 56. 8 times 7 is 56. I started spouting out all sorts of mathematical equations. The principal looked at me blankly. "He can't make out what you're saying," Mom told me. "Try to talk slowly." The principal asked me a few more questions I couldn't understand. With Mom translating, I gave answers that he couldn't understand. Then he asked Brian some questions, and they couldn't understand each other either. The principal decided that Brian and I were both a bit slow and had speech impediments that made it difficult for others to understand us. He placed us both in special classes for students with learning disabilities. "You'll have to impress them with your intelligence," Mom said as Brian and I headed off to school the next day. "Don't be afraid to be smarter than they are." It had rained the night before our first day of school. When Brian and I stepped off the bus at Welch Elementary, our shoes got soaked in the water that filled the muddy tire ruts left by the school buses. I looked around for the playground equipment, figuring I could win some new friends with the fierce tetherball skills I'd picked up at Emerson. But I didn't see a single seesaw or jungle gym, not to mention any tetherball poles. It had been cold ever since we arrived in Welch. The day before, Mom had unpacked the thrift shop coat she'd bought us in Phoenix. When I pointed out that all the buttons had been torn from mine, she said that minor flaw was more than offset by the fact that the coat was imported from France and made of 100% lamb's wool. As we waited for the opening bell, I stood with Brian at the edge of the playground, my arms crossed to keep my coat closed. The other kids stared at us, whispering among themselves, but they also kept their distance, as if they hadn't decided whether we were predators or prey. I had thought West Virginia was all white hillbillies. so I was surprised by how many black kids there were. I saw one tall black girl with a strong jaw and almond eyes smiling at me. I nodded and smiled back. Then I realized there was something malicious in her smile. I locked my arms tighter across my chest. I was in the 5th grade, so my day was divided into periods, with different teachers and classrooms for each. For the first period, I had West Virginia history. History was one of my favorite subjects. I was coiled and ready to raise my hand as soon as the teacher asked a question I could answer. But he stood at the front of the room next to a map of West Virginia, with all 55 counties outlined, and spent the entire class pointing to counties and asking students to identify them. In my second period, we passed the hour watching a film of the football game that Welch High had played several days earlier. Neither of those teachers introduced me to the class. They seemed as uncertain as the kids about how to act around a stranger. My next class was English for students with learning disabilities. Miss Caparosi started out by informing the class that it might surprise them to learn that some people in this world thought they were better than other people. They're convinced they're so special that they don't need to follow the rules other people have to follow, she said, like presenting their school records when they enroll in a new school. She looked at me and raised her eyebrows meaningfully. "Who thinks that's not fair?" she asked the class. All the kids except me raised their hands. "I see our new student doesn't agree," she said. "Perhaps you'd like to explain yourself?" I was sitting in the second to last row. The students in front of me swiveled their heads around to stare. I decided to dazzle them with the answer from the Ergo game. "Insufficient information to draw a conclusion," I said. "Oh, really?" Miss Caparosi asked. "Is that what they say in a big city like Phoenix?" She pronounced it Phoenix. Then she turned to the class and said in a high mocking voice, "Insufficient information to draw a conclusion." The class laughed violently. I felt something sharp and painful between my shoulder blades and turned around. The tall black girl with the almond eyes was sitting at the desk behind me. Holding up the sharp pencil she jabbed into my back, she smiled the same malicious smile I'd seen in the playground. I looked for Brian in the cafeteria at lunchtime, but 4th graders were on a different schedule. So I sat by myself and bit into the sandwich Irma had made for me that morning. It was tasteless and greasy. I pulled apart the 2 slices of Wonder Bread. Inside was a thin smear of lard. That was it. No meat, no cheese, not even a slice of pickle. Even so, I chewed slowly, staring intently at my bite marks in the bread to delay as long as possible the moment I would have to leave the cafeteria and go out to the playground. When I was the last student left in the cafeteria, the janitor, who was putting the chairs on the tabletop so the floor could be mopped, told me it was time to go. Outside, a thin mist hung in the still air. I pulled the sides of my lamb's wool coat together. 3 black girls, led by the one with the almond eyes, started moving toward me as soon as they saw me. A half-dozen other girls followed. Within moments, I was surrounded. "You think you're better than us?" the tall girl asked. "No," I said. "I think we're all equal." "You think you're as good as me?" She punched at me. When, instead of raising my hands in defense, I kept clutching my coat closed, she realized it had no buttons. "This girl ain't got no buttons on her coat," she shouted. That seemed to give her the license she needed. She pushed me in the chest, and I fell backward. I tried to get up, but all 3 girls started kicking me. I rolled away into a puddle, shouting for them to quit and hitting back at the feet coming at me from all sides. The other girls had closed in a circle around us, and none of the teachers could see what was going on. There was no stopping those girls until they'd had their fill. When we got home that afternoon, Mom and Dad were eager to hear about our first day. "It was good," I said. I didn't want to tell Mom the truth. I was in no mood to hear one of her lectures about the power of positive thinking. "See," she said, "I told you you'd fit right in." Brian shrugged off Mom and Dad's questions, and Lori didn't want to talk about her day at all. "How were the other kids?" I asked her later. "Okay," she said, but she turned away, and that was the end of the conversation. The bullying continued every day for weeks. The tall girl, whose name was Denisha Hewitt, watched me with her smile while we all waited on the asphalt playground for classes to start. At lunch, I ate my large sandwiches with paralytic slowness, but sooner or later, the janitor started putting the chairs up on the tables. I walked outside trying to hold my head high, and Denisha and her gang surrounded me. And it began. As we fought, they called me poor and ugly and dirty, and it was hard to argue the point. I had 3 dresses to my name, all hand-me-downs or from a thrift store, which meant each week I had to wear 2 of them twice. They were so worn from countless washings that the threads were beginning to separate. We were also always dirty. Not dry dirty like we'd been in the desert, but grimy dirty and smudged with oily dust from the coal-burning stove. Irma allowed us only 1 bath a week in 4 inches of water that had been heated on the kitchen stove and that all of us kids had to share. I thought of discussing the fighting with Dad, but I didn't want to sound like a whiner. Also, he'd rarely been sober since we had arrived at Welch, and I was afraid that if I told him, he'd show up at school snockered and make things even worse. I did try to talk to Mom. I couldn't bring myself to tell her about the beatings, fearing that if I did, she'd try to butt in, and she'd also only make things worse. I did say that these 3 black girls were giving me a hard time because we were so poor. Mom told me I should tell them there was nothing wrong with being poor, that Abraham Lincoln, the greatest president this country had ever seen, came from a dirt-poor family. She also said I should tell them that Martin Luther King Jr. would be ashamed of their behavior. Even though I knew these high-minded arguments would get me nowhere, I tried them anyway. Martin Luther King would be ashamed. And they made the 3 girls shriek with laughter as they pushed me to the ground. Lying in Stanley's bed at night with Lori, Brian, and Maureen, I concocted revenge scenarios. I imagined myself like Dad in his Air Force days, whooping the entire lot of them. After school, I'd go to the woodpile next to the basement and practice karate chops and drop kicks on the kindlin while laying down some pretty wicked cuss words. But I also kept thinking about Denisha, trying to make sense of her. I hoped for a while to befriend her. I'd seen Denisha smile a few times with genuine warmth, and it transformed her face. With a smile like that, she had to have some good in her. But I couldn't figure out how to get her to shine it my way. About a month after I'd started school, I was walking up some steps to a park at the top of a hill when I heard a low, furious barking coming from the other side of the World War I memorial. I ran up the stairs and saw a big, lathered-up mongrel cornering a little black kid of about 5 or 6 against the monument. The kid kept giving kicks at the dog as it barked and lunged at him. The kid was looking over the tree line on the far side of the park, and I could tell he was calculating the chances of making it over there. "Don't run!" I shouted. The boy looked up at me. So did the dog, and in that instant, the kid took off in a hopeless dash for the trees. The dog bounded after him, barking, then caught up with him and snapped at his legs. Now, there are mad dogs and wild dogs and killer dogs, and any one of them would go for your throat and hold on until you or it was dead. But I could tell this dog was not truly bad. Instead of tearing into the kid, it was just having fun terrifying him, growling and pulling on his pant leg, but doing no real damage. It was just a mutt who had been kicked around too much and was happy to find a creature who was afraid of it. I picked up a stick and raced toward them. "Go on now," I shouted at the dog. When I raised the stick, it whimpered and slunk off. The dog's teeth had not broken the boy's skin, but his pant leg was torn, and he was trembling as if he had palsy. I offered to take him home, and I ended up carrying him piggyback. He was feather light. I couldn't get a word out of him except the most minimal directions. Up there, that way, in a voice I could barely hear. The houses in the neighborhood were old but freshly painted, some in bright colors like lavender or Kelly green. "This here," the boy whispered when we came to a house with blue shutters. It had a neat yard, but was so small that dwarves could have lived there. When I put the kid down, he dashed up the steps and through the door. I turned to go. Denisha Hewitt was standing on the porch across the street, looking at me curiously. The next day, when I went out onto the playground after lunch, the gang of girls started toward me. But Denisha hung back. Without their leader, the others lost their sense of purpose and stopped short of me. The following week, Denisha asked me for help in an English assignment. She never said she was sorry for the bullying, or even mentioned it, but she thanked me for bringing her neighbor home that night, and I figured that her request for help was as close to an apology as I would ever get. Irma had made it clear how she felt about black people, so instead of inviting Denisha to our house to work on her assignment, I suggested on the upcoming Saturday I'd go to hers. That day I was leaving the house at the same time as Uncle Stanley. He never had the wherewithal to learn to drive, but someone from the appliance store where he worked was picking him up. He asked me if I wanted a ride too. When I told him where I was headed, he frowned. "That's Niggerville," he said. "What you going there for?" Stanley didn't want his friend to drive me there, so I walked. When I got back home later in the afternoon, the house was empty except for Irma, who never set foot outside. She stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of green beans and taking swigs from the bottle of hooch in her pocket. "So how was Niggerville?" she asked. Irma was always going on about the niggers. Her and Grandpa's house was on Court Street, on the edge of the black neighborhood. It galled her when they started moving into that section of town, and she always said it was their fault that Welch had gone downhill. When you were sitting in the living room, where Irma always kept the shades drawn, you could hear groups of black people walking into town, talking and laughing. "Goddamn niggers," Irma always muttered. "The reason I have not gone out of this house in 15 years is because I do not want to see or be seen by a nigger." Mom and Dad had always forbidden us to use that word. It was much worse than any curse word, they told us. But since Irma was my grandmother, I never said anything when she used it. Irma kept stirring the beans. "Keep this up, and people are going to think you're a nigger lover," she said. She gave me a serious look, as if imparting a meaningful life lesson I should ponder and absorb. She unscrewed the cap from her bottle of hooch and took a long, contemplative swallow. As I watched her drinking, I felt this pressure building in my chest and had to let it out. "You're not supposed to use that word," I said. Irma's face went slack with astonishment. "Mom says they're just like us," I continued, "except they have different complexions." Irma glared at me. I thought she was going to backhand me, but instead she said, "You ungrateful little shit. I'll be damned if you're eating my food tonight. Get your worthless ass down to the basement." Lori gave me a hug when she'd heard I told off Irma. Mom was upset, though. "We may not agree with all of Irma's views," she said, "but we have to remember that as long as we're her guests, we have to be polite." That didn't seem like Mom. She and Dad happily railed against anyone they disliked or disrespected, Standard Oil executives, J. Edgar Hoover, and especially snobs and racists. They'd always encouraged us to be outspoken about our opinions, but now we were supposed to bite our tongues. But she was right. Irma would boot us. Situations like these, I realized, were what turned people into hypocrites. I hate Irma, I told Mom. You have to show compassion for her, Mom said. Irma's parents had died when she was young, Mom explained, and she'd been shipped off to one relative after another who had treated her like a servant. Scrubbing clothes on a washboard until her knuckles bled. That was the preeminent memory of Irma's childhood. The best thing Grandpa did for her when they got married was buy her an electric washing machine. But whatever joy it had once given her was long gone. Irma can't let go of her misery, Mom said. It's all she knows. She added that you should never hate anyone, even your worst enemies. Everyone has something good about them, she said. You have to find that redeeming quality and love the person for that. Oh, yeah? I said. What about Hitler? What was his redeeming quality? Hitler loved dogs, Mom said without hesitation. In late winter, Mom and Dad decided to drive the Oldsmobile back to Phoenix. They said they were going to fetch our bikes and all the other stuff we'd had to leave behind, pick up copies of our school records, and see if they could rescue Mom's fruitwood archery set from the irrigation ditch alongside the road to the Grand Canyon. We kids were to remain in Welch. Since Lori was the oldest, Mom and Dad said she was in charge. Of course, we were all answerable to Irma. They left one morning during a thaw. I could tell by the high color in Mom's cheeks that she was excited about the prospect of an adventure. Dad was also clearly itching to get out of Welch. He had not found a job, and we were dependent on Irma for everything. Lori had suggested that Dad go to work in the mines, but he said the mines were controlled by the unions, and the unions were controlled by the mob, and the mob had blackballed him for investigating corruption in the electricians' union back in Phoenix. Another reason for him to return to Phoenix was to gather his research on corruption, because the only way he could get a job in the mines was by helping reform the United Mine Workers of America. I wished we were all going together. I wanted to be back in Phoenix, sitting under the orange trees behind our adobe house, riding my bike to the library, eating free bananas in a school where the teachers thought I was smart. I wanted to feel the desert sun on my face and breathe in the dry desert air and climb the steep rock mountains where Dad led us on one of the long hikes that he called geological survey expeditions. I asked if we could all go, but Dad said he and Mom were making a quick trip, strictly business, and we kids would only get in the way. Besides, he couldn't go taking us out of school in the middle of the year. I pointed out that it had never bothered him before. Welch wasn't like those other places we had lived, he said. There were rules that had to be followed, and people didn't take it kindly when you flouted them. Do you think they'll come back? Brian asked as Mom and Dad drove off. Of course, I said, though I had been wondering the same thing. These days, we seemed more of an inconvenience than we used to be. Lori was already a teenager, and in a couple of years, Brian and I would be too. They couldn't toss us into the back of a U-Haul or put us in cardboard boxes at night. Brian and I started running after the Oldsmobile. Mom turned once and waved, and Dad stuck his hand out the window. We followed them all the way down Court Street, where they picked up speed and then turned the corner. I had to believe they'd come back, I told myself. If I didn't believe, then they might not return. They might leave us forever. After Mom and Dad left, Irma became even more cantankerous. If she didn't like the look on our faces, she would hit us on the head with a serving spoon. Once she pulled out a framed photograph of her father and told us he was the only person who had ever loved her. She talked on and on about how much she'd suffered as an orphan at the hands of her aunts and uncles, who hadn't treated her half as kindly as she was treating us. About a week after Mom and Dad had left, we kids were all sitting in Irma's living room watching TV. Stanley was sleeping in the foyer. Irma, who'd been drinking since before breakfast, told Brian that his breeches needed mending. He started to take them off, but Irma said she didn't want him running around the house in his skivvies or with a towel wrapped around him, looking like he was wearing a goddamn dress. It would be easier for her to mend the breeches while he was still wearing them. She ordered him to follow her into Grandpa's bedroom, where she kept her sewing kit. They'd been gone for a minute or two when I heard Brian weakly protesting. I went into Grandpa's bedroom and saw Irma kneeling on the floor in front of Brian, grabbing at the crotch of his pants, squeezing and kneading while mumbling to herself and telling Brian to hold still, goddammit. Brian, his cheeks wet with tears, was holding his hands protectively between his legs. "Irma, you leave him alone!" I shouted. Irma, still on her knees, twisted around and glared at me. "Why, you little bitch," she said. Lori heard the commotion and came running. I told Lori that Irma was touching Brian in a way that she ought not to be. Irma said she was merely mending Brian's inseam and that she shouldn't have to defend herself against some lying little whore's accusations. "I know what I saw," I said. "She's a pervert." Irma reached over to slap me, but Lori caught her hand. "Let's all calm down," Lori said in the same voice she used when Mom and Dad got carried away arguing. "Everybody, calm down." Irma jerked her hand out of Lori's grasp and slapped her so hard that Lori's glasses went flying across the room. Lori, who had turned 13, slapped her back. Irma hit Lori again, and this time Lori struck Irma a blow in the jaw. Then they flew at each other, tussling and flailing and pulling hair, locked together, with Brian and me cheering on Lori until we woke up Uncle Stanley, who staggered into the room and pushed them apart. Irma relegated us to the basement after that. A door in the basement led directly outside, so we never went upstairs. We weren't even allowed to use Irma's bathroom, which meant we either had to wait for school or go outside after dark. Uncle Stanley sometimes sneaked down beans he'd boiled for us, but he was afraid if he stayed talking, Irma would think he'd taken our side and get mad at him too. The following week, a storm hit. The temperature dropped and a foot of snow fell on Welch. Irma wouldn't let us use any coal. She said we didn't know how to operate the stove and would burn the house down. And it was so cold in the basement that Lori, Brian, Maureen, and I were glad we all shared one bed. As soon as we got home from school, we'd climb under the covers with our clothes on and do our homework there. We were in bed the night Mom and Dad came back. We didn't hear the sound of the car pulling up. All we heard was the front door opening upstairs, then Mom and Dad's voices, and Irma beginning the long narrative of her grievances against us. That was followed by the sound of Dad stomping down the stairs into the basement, furious at all of us, me for back-talking Irma and making wild accusations, and Lori even more for daring to strike her own grandmother, and Brian for being such a pussy and starting the whole thing. I thought Dad would come around to our side once he'd heard what happened, and I tried to explain. "I don't care what happened," he yelled. "But we were just protecting ourselves," I said. "Brian's a man. He can take it," he said. "I don't want to hear another word of this. Do you hear me?" He was shaking his head, but wildly, almost as if he thought he could keep out the sound of my voice. He wouldn't even look at me. After Dad had gone back upstairs to tie into Irma's hooch and we kids were all in bed, Brian bit my toe to try to make me laugh. But I kicked him away. We all lay there in the silent darkness. "Dad was really weird," I said, because someone had to say it. "You'd be weird too if Irma was your mom," Lori said. "Do you think she ever did something to Dad like what she did to Brian?" I asked. No one said a thing. It was gross and creepy to think about it, but it would explain a lot. Why Dad left home as soon as he could. Why he drank so much and why he got so angry. Why he never wanted to visit Welch when we were younger. Why he at first refused to come to West Virginia with us, and only at the last possible moment overcame his reluctance and jumped into the car. Why he was shaking his head so hard, almost like he wanted to put his hands over his ears when I tried to explain what Irma had been doing to Brian. Don't think about things like that, Lori told me. It'll make you crazy. And so I put it out of my mind.